My contribution to the book, I have concentrated on the Smith family and how we as a family came from the Strathblane area, north of Glasgow, and settled in Port Glasgow in 1875. Each of the three other branches of the family, the Dunlops on my father's side, the Dick family on my mother's side, and the MacArthurs, also on my mother's side, have themselves interesting stories to tell and how they got to Port Glasgow. One in particular is about the MacArthurs. The MacArthurs on my mother's side came to Greenock from Islay about 1849. Colin MacArthur and Mary Weir were married in 1847 on Islay, and they had a son Archibald, who we meet again with his parents in the 1851 census, living in Greenock with Colin working in the distillery in Tobago Street. The marriage is interesting as Colin was an Islay man by birth, but Mary came from the Cowal Peninsula near Dunoon, almost 40 miles away. How did they meet? When I research my family's history, I also like researching their surroundings, and I began to answer my question by finding out where Colin and Mary lived on Islay before they married. It turned out that they lived on two farms next to each other, called Ochtavulen and Skerrels, about 2 miles from Islay House, just north of Beaumore. The farms have turned out to have rich connections with Scottish history and are the solution as to how Colin met Mary. The farms have histories that go back 800 years and involve a bishop, a pope, 2 Scottish kings and the Highland clearances. The Bishop of Dunkeld and Pope Innocent III, on the 9th of December 1203, agreed to form the bishopric of Iona, and the 2 farms were part of the new bishopric according to the treaty signed by the Pope. In 1494, King James IV, my favourite Scottish king, had destroyed the power of the Lords of the Isles, and he had an inventory done of the lands of Islay. He gave some to John Massian of Arnamurchan, and the farms, still church property at this date, are mentioned again in a document signed by the king. On the 15th of March 1587, James VI of Scotland, who now owned all the church's land after the Reformation of 1560, was giving land to his nobles such as Henry MacLean, and the farms, no longer church property, were part of the gift and again are mentioned in the document signed by a king. Finally, in the 1830s, William Frederick Campbell owned the island of Islay, and he wanted to increase his rent by making his farms more productive by bringing in lowland farmers who could farm differently from his existing farmers. On the 1841 census, only Colin is mentioned with his father and family living at Ochtavulen Farm, but when I look at the 1851 census, Colin's father had been moved to the smaller farm, Skerrels, and Walter Weir, brother of Mary, was farming 60 acres of Ochtavulen. So Walter, one of the new breed farmers, must have moved from Cowal after 1841, and that is how Mary and Colin met, due to the Highland clearances. It's an ill wind that blows nobody good. The second of my families, the Scots-Irish Dunlops, on my father's side, were from around Londonderry, and they arrived in Port Glasgow about the 1880s. They prospered, but tragedy happened to the family when James Jameson, grandfather to Bessie Dunlop, my grandmother, died on June the 22nd, 1896. He died of a fracture of the skull. He was aged 47. Something was dropped on his head in Russell's shipyard, fracturing his skull, and he died in the Greenock Infirmary. He was staying at 116 Bouverie Street, Port Glasgow at the time. The Irish connection remained strong, however, and my father remembered being at school in Northern Ireland, aged between 5 and 10 years of age in the early 1900s. Finally, the last of my families, the Dick family, on my mother's side, arrived from Arbroath with my great-grandfather James moving to Port Glasgow with his sister and her son about 1880 and living at Laird Street. James's father, Charles, was a flax mill overseer in Arbroath, and he and his brother had to have had good positions in the community, as both they and their families are buried with enormous gravestones in the cemetery inside the grounds of Arbroath Abbey. Now, returning to the Smith family. The Smith name today is very common. However, around Strathblane there is a long history of Smiths. At the castle of Craigend there was a Smith family that had been armourers to the lords who had lived at Murdoch Castle from about the 13th century. A Smith of this family I remember by name, for when I was at the University of Strathclyde, I bought all my textbooks from John Smith's bookstore in St Vincent Street in Glasgow, and the shop had been opened by John Smith of Craigend in the 18th century. I must confess I haven't made a firm connection yet between the Craigend Smiths to my own Smith family, but I'm still exploring. Again, talking about places like the Isla Farms that are connected to the family, the one that has meant most since 1875 was at Gowan Street in Port Glasgow. The street was the birthplace and unfortunately the place of death for Smiths and Dick families, and also the street where my father probably met and courted my mother. My great-grandfather, Alexander Smith, lived there from 1875 till his death in 1923, a period of 48 years. He lived most of the time at 89 Argowan Street at the corner of Argyle Street and 43 Argowan Street at the corner of Houston Street. Argowan Street was built around the late 1870s and became a second centre for Glasgow to the west of the Glen. Originally called Greenock Road, there were up to 40 shops in this small stretch, including 4 confectioners, 4 grocers, 2 cooperatives, 2 dairymen, 2 restaurants, and many tradesmen, including my great-grandfather, who was a shoemaker. Life for Alexander and his wife Catherine was full, with 7 children being born, mostly in 89 Argowan Street, and 7 deaths, mainly out of 43 Argowan Street. One notable death was not in Argowan Street, when Alexander's son David was killed in Belgium in November 1914 in World War I. There were also good times, with Isabella marrying in 1916 and Catherine marrying in New York in 1906, and lots of grandchildren born. How did my father meet my mother, and what did this have to do with Argowan Street? Well, James Dick of Arbroath, who had settled at Laird Street, married Mary Hines in 1894. They eventually lived at 19 Argowan Street. In 1918, James died, and their son, my grandfather, also a James, moved his family, including my mother Maisie, aged 8, from St John Street in Greenock to live with the grandmother. My mother went to Jean Street School and then to work in the Glen Mill. My father's connection with Argowan Street was that his grandmother and grandfather lived there, and many of his uncles and aunts. In the 1920s, he rowed for the Davy Shore Club on Russell Street, which leads off Argowan Street. He competed with his brothers John and Sam, and eventually won a Scottish gold medal racing jolly boats in 1928 in the pairs with Sam. My mother told me she used to run down the bank cheering when he raced. They were eventually married in 1932. They moved from 8 Bruce Street to 12 Park Road near Broadfield House in 1946, into a house that German prisoners of war probably had a hand in building. My brothers remember my mother giving the prisoners coffee as they worked on the Broadfield Avenue houses. I and my 4 brothers grew up there, heavily involved in another of my father's passions, model yachting at the Mill Dam that supplied water to the Gourock Roadworks. The Port Glasgow Club was very active from its formation in 1922. My father took the club to a new level by winning a British Championship in 1950 and aiding my brother Bob in winning a second British Championship at Barshaw Park in Paisley in 1954. Now we as a family are scattered far and wide. With the miracle of Skype, a web video service, we can keep almost instantly in touch. What could we have been if we had all stayed here and worked together? We will never know. The one thing we have retained is our family identity, and that is what is of importance to us above all else.
My journey on the big red bus. It was a long walk from our Minto Street home in Greenock South West to the bus terminus at Prince's Pier. It was especially long for me as a young lad of 14, but thankfully it was all downhill. In answer to my continuing questioning, my father would reply, "It's just round the next corner, not long now." What a motivator. We walked everywhere. Although he had been a chauffeur to Greenock's landed gentry 22 years earlier, in the Depression of 1926, I never saw him drive. Like other working men of the time, he had no car, so we walked. This was a special day out for me, alone with my dad and heading to the big shops in Glasgow for a pair of long trousers. Yes, long trousers, and I was 14. To keep the cost down, my mother had decided to stay at home with my young brother aged 10. "That will let the two of you see the replay on Wednesday," she said. We had been to the first match at Hampden Park, my Morton heroes matching the almighty Glasgow Rangers in a thrilling 1-1 draw in the Scottish Cup final. The Lower Clyde of Greenock and Port Glasgow versus the Upper Clyde of Govan. Along with 131,627 others, we had seen Morton outplay their more illustrious opponents. A sea of bunnets, stretched out like a massive tray of pancakes across a baker's counter, had swayed with every attacking move. The same bunnets which were worn to their wearer's place of work, the shipyards, boiler makers, engineering works and the steel yards. The faces were weather-beaten and lined, and strained each sinew to take in every move on the Hampden pitch. What a day that had been. Now I was about to get another day out, this time shopping for long trousers. The number 19 bus stood shining, tall and very red. "It's a double-decker," I beamed from a shining face, scrubbed so by my mother's face flannel. "Can we go upstairs, please, Dad? I'll be able to see the shipyards better." My dad nodded in agreement, so we sat in the big red bus, staring backwards at the hive of activity behind us. Trains, steam puffing out of their funnels like great volcanoes, ready for the long haul uphill towards Kilmacombe, Bridge of Weir, Paisley and on to Glasgow. A steamer sat proud and upright at Prince's Pier, ready for the journey to Helensburgh and Craigendorn. The Clyde pilot boat ushered a great cargo ship bearing sugar from the West Indies to its destination at James Watt Dock. Warships of the fleet anchored at the tail of the bank, their sombre grey war paint glistening in the sun. Amongst it all, young mothers parading their new offspring the entire length of Greenock's Esplanade in their large coach prams. With a wheeze and a cough, the large diesel bus began its journey. The destination board had indicated that the journey was through Kilmacombe. I would miss a good bit of the river, but I would see how the other half lived. Past the Glebe sugar refinery it rattled, the hard seats bouncing me like a rubber ball. Past Cairds Yard and the majestic municipal buildings and town hall of Greenock. Past the magnificent Custom House quay with its sandstone building, housing the many customs officers whose predecessors had tackled smugglers and pirates in romantic but brutal bygone days. Past Rue End, badly blitzed during the war, some tenements still not cleared of rubble. Past the East India Harbour, its small boats like corks on the placid waters of the Clyde. Then, there it was. A giant in front of our bus. A giant with thousands of legs, running like an Olympic athlete to the sounds of a great horn, calling each pair of legs to run faster than its neighbour. The legs ran and jumped over the rail track stretched across the main road. A rail track destined to carry many a sheet of steel or boiler or engine from its parent to the great ship being built at Scott's shipyard. These legs were those of the men and women who worked at Scott's. The dinner hooter had called them home. Many lived around the area in their tall, dark, gaslit tenement homes with no bath and only cold water. Others streamed onto yet more red buses to take them to outlying areas where mince and tatties was the favourite dish for the midday meal, the dinner. Evening dinner, what we called our tea, was for toffs, not the workers. The massive bodies, gone like snow off a dike, stirred the bus driver back into action. Across the rail track, towards James Dock, where the sugar boat, which we had seen earlier, was tying up alongside the large brick sheds. The dockers lined the quayside, hauling the ship ropes to the heavy steel bollards in readiness for the unloading of its Jamaican cargo into the bonded sugar sheds. From there it would be released into the trucks for delivery to the large Westburn and Walker's sugar refineries. Past Inchgreen and many more red buses, the fleet of Western SMT Company to Lithgow's, another giant of the shipbuilding world. This world was a hive of industry. The bees, each with their own skill and trade, each with their own worries over money and scraping to keep a family fed and clothed, but each, in its own way, determined to show that Clyde built meant something to the world. This world was greedy for ships. The Clyde was greedy for success. Its cup would never be overflowing, but its children depended on it. The world knows that. It will always come back for more. That was a belief. Onwards to Port Glasgow and more signs of the sea. Birkmeyer's Rope Works, where the world's shipping bought its hemp and flax products. Its building stood tall at the railway bridge across the road from Ferguson's shipyard, specialising in smaller ships. For me, the best part of the journey was over. Leaving behind the flat land and its proximity to the river, the bus wheezed and clanked its way up the Clune Brae, the driver making successive changes of gear, coaxing the red bus up the hill. He too was a master craftsman. Like the men of the shipyards, he took pride in his work. This was his bus, his passengers, his route. What a transformation as we coasted through Kilmacombe. 3 miles from the last shipyard, but 1,000,000 miles from reality. Each house we passed had its own name. Homes to the shipyard bosses, sugar barons, tobacco lords, bankers and men of the merchant city. These houses were built to last. Unlike the Greenock tenements, sandstone frontages, but red brick elsewhere, destined to crumble to dust within 100 years. The fully sandstone houses of Kilmacombe would see decades and decades of life. Yet there was no life. No one hanging out washing. No kids with a ball or skipping ropes. No life. How the other half lived. How lucky I was to have been born into a working family. As I mused in that thought, sleep took over, and I dreamed of the sea and the ships, and above all, the people.